I'd like to discuss with you today how society shaped women's roles in opera. And I'd like to start today's lecture with a quote by Clara Schumann. She stated that, "I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it, should I expect to be the one." This is just an example of how society impacted women of their time. I want to start with the Baroque era. I'd like to talk about how women were dependent on men. They were married very young, and once they were married, they lost all identity of themselves. They became a part of their husbands. They were not allowed to work. The few jobs that were available to women were midwives, but most were expected to be wives and mothers. And being a mother was very important at this time because most children were lost due to illness. The higher class had more education in it than the lower class women did. So some of the more wealthy women of the age had tutors that would come to their house and teach them subjects such as music, also writing and needlework. There were some schools that were boarding schools for all girls, no boys, and they also taught the same subjects, and they were more higher class as well. The poor community did not have a lot of education, and most women were illiterate. The farmers' wives were expected to help with the farm, but they couldn't do much else. During the Baroque era, there was a composer named Monteverdi in Italy, and at the time, women were not allowed to sing in church or to perform on stage in Rome. So they used what is called castrati, and the castrati are men who were castrated at a young age in order to retain their higher voices in place of women. So men were playing women's parts. In Europe, castrati were very popular. There were a few women, especially in England, who did take to the stage, and two of them were Francesca Cuzzoni and Faustina Bordini, and they both worked for Handel in the Royal Academy. During this time, the terms divas and prima donnas were born. Divas referred to the sopranos in general, and prima donnas was the main soprano. And it has taken on a negative connotation throughout the years because of their demands of the librettists and the composers. Francesca Cuzzoni and Faustina Bordini worked alongside castrati, and they also were rumored to have helped end the Royal Academy with their fights. Yeah. So Monteverdi composed an opera named Orfeo, and it is based off the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice from Greek myth. And in it, Eurydice, or Eurydice, does not play a very important role, unfortunately. She is in the beginning of the opera, and it's her wedding day. We don't have her backstory. She's just seen as a woman in love. She's infatuated with Orfeo, and she unfortunately dies on her wedding day, and Orfeo is stricken with grief, and then goes and pleads with the gods to rescue his love from Hades. So the opera is about Orfeo's journey to save Eurydice, and at the end the god said that he could rescue her, but when they are leaving the underworld, he could not look or talk to her. And Eurydice didn't understand this and was worried that he didn't love her anymore, and as he exited the underworld, he got excited to see her again, turned around, and she was taken back to Hades. Purcell in England wrote another myth-based opera named Dido and Aeneas. This was actually performed all by girls, whereas Orfeo had a castrato as Eurydice, and Dido and Aeneas was all women, and Dido, it was the queen and founder of Carthage in ancient Greek text. In his opera, she is turned from this intimidating woman into a lovelorn, hopeless love interest for Aeneas. And as he leaves because the gods call him off for duty, she kills herself instead of continuing on with her life. This is a picture of a famous castrati, one of the most famous, Farinelli, and actually Francesca Cuzzoni. So from England, this is when they performed together in London. Moving on to the classical era, society still did not allow women to do many things. Jobs were becoming more available, but still in very feminine type of roles. So they could work with textiles, they helped with labor, some of them were apothecaries, but most were not. Most were wives and mothers. Actually, spinsters were looked down upon. They were hunted down as witches. They were feared. If a woman was not married by the age of 25 during this era, people thought it as a social humiliation. So women began to replace the castrati during this era. They started falling out of favor, and we actually see women playing women and playing men. So Mozart actually has a lot of pants roles as well, so you'll see girls on stage playing boys and girls instead of how it used to be where all men played everything. Mozart's Die Zauberflöte is a story that is laden with political and religious protests, in a sense. It was written for the middle class. The middle class was a big fan of this opera, and one of its main characters is Pamina, who is a princess. During the first act of the opera, Pamina is portrayed as the stereotypical princess, as we would think today. She is beautiful, which causes the prince to fall in love with her before he even sees her, and Pamina in turn falls in love with him before she meets him, due to the fact that he loves her and is trying to rescue her. She is kidnapped, she is being hit on by people she doesn't want to hit on her, her mother is trying to manipulate her. It's just the average princess story, and then it moves on into the second act, and Pamina develops more depth to her character, which we haven't seen in opera before this. So she is one of the first female roles that has more than a stereotypical, she's pretty or she's a mother. She is more than that. She ends up leading Tamino through all his trials, and it's kind of a slap in the face to show that men do need their women in their lives. This is actually a picture of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart with his father Leopold and his sister. His sister was also taught music and performed alongside with him, but she stopped when she was married. The Romantic era had the most women working until World War II, when we would have women working again. This is because of the factories and the Industrial Revolution. Still, they were not allowed to work in professions that men worked in, so you did not see any doctors or lawyers. They worked in millineries, they were tailors, still the midwife thing. They could support themselves off of this, but life was very difficult if you wanted to. They were cheaper work, so factories actually preferred to hire women because they didn't have to pay as much. The laws did state that women could not work a certain amount of hours, and that they were not allowed to lift any heavy objects. They could live by themselves, but it was very unlikely that they either had to or that it was always possible. A lot of them died very young because of poor conditions. Married women had it a little easier off, but they still typically worked at this era. So I mentioned divas earlier, and we still had our divas, and they were gaining fame during the Romantic era, becoming very popular amongst the people. But we also had women who were coming up as composers and concert pianists and other aspects of music. We did not see a lot of female conductors or teachers in higher education. Clara Schumann actually was one, but she was one of very few, and she didn't think very highly of herself. Puccini composed an opera named La Bohème, which is based off the Bohemian life during the 1800s, and it shows what it was like to live as a poor woman during this age. It was very realistic compared to operas before it, which were more fantastic or myth-based. He showed through Mimi, his main character, what a grisette woman, which is a French term for the working class women, and it was coined because of the color of their dresses. They could not afford to have colorful dresses, so they ended up wearing gray and were hence called the grisettes. Mimi is a grisette. She is a seamstress, and which was a common job for women of the time. She falls in love with a poor artist, and during her time with him, her life is a little better, but we see that Mimi, even from the beginning of the show, is so poor she cannot afford heat or light, and she is slowly dying, and she actually does end up dying at the end of the opera to the despair of all of the characters around her. This is a picture of a grisette of the time, and this is Anna Netrebko as Mimi in La Bohème. So the 20th century, we're all a little more familiar with this one. Women's rights movements started in the late 1800s but weren't as big as they were in the 20th century, and they still continue to go on to this day. Women were fighting for equality, for the right to vote, for the right to be able to do things that men were able to do. The stereotypes of the years before, where women are only supposed to be housewives or mothers or could only work in certain fields, is starting to be broken, especially with World War II, when more women were in the service than had ever worked, except for in the Romantic era during the industrial age. We start to see that more women composers are appearing. We also see female conductors, which is new because it's typically a male-dominated area of music. Women are starting to become teachers of music in higher education, so college levels, instead of just the school teacher who teaches the young children. They also still continue to be the singers, but we also see theorists and more male, thought of male terms. Menotti wrote an opera called The Medium. Menotti actually composed this opera in America, so it's an American piece. It's in English, which is fairly new for a lot of the big standard repertoire operas. He has two women in his operas that compare the old views and the new views of the coming of the new 20th century. Madame Flora is one of the main characters, and she is the medium. She is an older woman. She has a daughter named Monica, and Madame Flora holds seances to trick people, and during one of her seances, she believes that she feels a hand on her throat and starts accusing those around her of tricking her into thinking that she's crazy. Well, her daughter is seen as more mature for her age, although naive. And it shows the old, how women were portrayed and how they were starting to come up in the world with naive but still a little more mature, and with the older, more stereotypical view of women. And Madame Flora ends up accidentally killing her servant boy because of her own beliefs. So to wrap up my lecture, I want to make the point that I think we have come one step forward and are still 2 steps back. Although women have come very far since the Baroque time with opera, we still do not see a lot of women in certain areas like conducting or theorists, or we are thought that we have to always be the diva, or a soprano is considered a prima donna because she needs one thing, and it's time to break the stereotypes. Are there any questions? Yes.
What kinds of things do you think we can do to take steps to help this progress?
I think actually that a lot of the fear that is instilled in women by society, if women are brave enough to break that fear ourselves and become what we want to become instead of letting something else tell us not to, then we will continue to progress. Yes?
How do you see this knowledge that you gained from looking at this history and where we are now kind of shaping you in potential career path? How will it influence you in your profession?
Well, I try not to be the stereotype, first of all, because I've heard it so much. I don't want to be considered a diva and a prima donna, and I'm trying to break my own thoughts of having that be a negative thing.